I know that some people in Egypt have old-fashioned ideas. Old-fashioned ideas based on the assumption that the Nile water belongs to Egypt, and that Egypt has the right to decide as to who gets what of the Nile water, and that the upper riparian countries are unable to use the Nile water because they will be unstable and because they will be poor. These circumstances have changed and changed forever. Ethiopia is not unstable. Ethiopia is still poor, but it is able to cough up the necessary resources to build whatever infrastructure and dams it wants on the Nile waters. No, well, we are not pushing it more than anybody else. Everybody is interested in it, and all of us are agreed that this should go forward. And as far as negotiating further is concerned, we see no reason why Egypt, and I think it's mainly Egypt, Sudan is not a main problem in this regard. I see no reason why Egypt should not come back to the fold. Egypt will not be able to stop Ethiopia from building dams on the Nile. That is history, and that is not going to be part of the. What I am suggesting that we are beyond that Ethiopia is able and willing to use its own resources to build dams on the Nile. That is not the way forward. The way forward is not for Egypt to try and stop the unstoppable. The way forward is to seek a win-win solution through diplomatic efforts. There is nothing more we can do than what we are already doing, which is to continue to develop our resources, including the Nile water resources. We are aware of such risk, and our next 5-year plan does not depend on money from the international institutions or Western donors to build dams. It is primarily dependent on our own capacity, obviously. But Somalia has had more than its fair share of challenges in the past, and I'm sure they will overcome this challenge too. I would dispute that assertion because, as you know, for example, the Ahlus Sunnah group is now part of government, and it controls a very large swath of central Somalia. And so the central government in Somalia does control a lot more than Villa Somalia. And I don't think this is going to be the end of the transitional government. Al-Shabaab is in a very precarious condition. There's division within the ranks of the terrorists. They have been fighting each other. And they have been unable to launch the so-called final offensive against the transitional government in Villa Somalia. And so the circumstances are not as dire as they are sometimes made to be. In hindsight, I think it was a perfect decision. Forcing the so-called moderate Islamists down from the Shabab horse, we precipitated a crystallization of political opinion in the Islamist camp, and now the moderate Islamist camp has its own identity, has its own program, which are very different from that of Al-Shabaab. We broke the so-called United Front of Islamists. It's the time to deploy its troops, to replace our troops, and we felt it was well worth the price to pay to make it possible for the African Union to deploy. Quite a few hundred.
Do you have an exact figure?
I have, but I'm not prepared to divulge it. The families have been notified. That's the most important.
Why is that a state secret?
Because the families have already been notified. It was not a misadventure. It was a necessary step for self-defense. Well, assuming that our party wins these elections, the decision of our party is that the old generation would retire over the course of the next term of parliament, and that I would oversee the retirement. I will be one of those who would retire over the period of the next things. Really, first, it's very clear now that the people of Ethiopia across the board want these elections to be free, fair, and peaceful, and they have the means to do it. Second, the government has put in place all the necessary checks, balances, and mechanisms, rules, regulations, to make sure that these elections are fair, free, and peaceful. And to a certain extent, part of the opposition is also committed.